So today we are looking at Macduff, the quiet force that dismantles a tyrant. And I know so many students are worried about Macduff coming up on the exam, and he very well could. So let's get into it. So summary of Macduff first of all then. So Macduff is a Scottish nobleman who emerges as Macbeth's key antagonist. He is a moral foil to Macbeth and functions as the embodiment of justice, loyalty, and emotional depth. Through Macduff, Shakespeare explores what it means to be a good man, a good leader, and a loyal subject, aligning him with the theme of legitimate kingship and the restoration of moral order. His significance is highlighted by his role in restoring legitimate kingship through the crowning of Malcolm. So why is he significant? A lot of you ask this, but he really is. So he exposes Macbeth's tyranny and challenges the corrupt kingship that Macbeth represents. He becomes the agent of justice and moral order within the play. He personifies emotional integrity, challenging the rigid ideals of masculinity, and he symbolises patriotism, acting for the greater good of Scotland. And finally, he is a key vehicle. That's a key method for Shakespeare to explore kingship, moral governance, and the true qualities of a ruler. So his key moments then, a lot of you are worried, and these are the things that you can focus on in an essay. So the discovery of Duncan's murder and the display of honest grief, which is a contrast to Macbeth's performative reaction. So Macbeth kind of fakes being sad, whereas Macduff comes in, you can think about the timing of that as well. The fact that Macduff, the one who is going to save the day at the end of the play, arrives right at the moment when Macbeth has committed this grave moral crime. And then his refusal to attend Macbeth's coronation hints at his early suspicion and moral independence. Also, his flight to England, by which I mean him running to England, not him actually jumping on a plane, but he sacrifices personal safety for political integrity and aligns himself with Malcolm. And he reimagines masculinity as including personal emotional expression. That was unusual at the time. And we see Macduff's grief, which humanises him. And then we have the final confrontation, of course, which delivers poetic justice, which is where justice is served within a text. And this fulfills the prophecy and restores rightful kingship. So key quotations that we can look at for Macduff. So first of all, nice and easy in Act 2, Scene 3, oh horror, horror, horror. And we have here a tricolon, which is a threefold repetition of horror, which intensifies Macduff's shock and mimics the rhythm of a ritual lament. And the exclamation shows unfiltered emotional response, and this contrasts with Macbeth's staged grief, as I mentioned earlier, and the abstract noun horror is never specified, suggesting the act is beyond words, almost unspeakable. And remember, the murder has taken place off stage because it was such a terrible crime to commit an act of regicide. And it's worth noting as well that the murder of Macbeth also takes place off stage. I know some directors choose to show it on stage, but in the original production of Macbeth, both of those acts of regicide, because remember Macbeth was king at the time of being murdered, would have taken place off stage. So this immediately presents Macduff as morally upright and emotionally transparent. And his shock underscores the sacrilegious nature of Duncan's murder as it goes directly against God. And it enhances his role as a moral foil, as I mentioned earlier, to Macbeth and builds dramatic irony. So next up we have most sacrilegious murder hath broke ope the Lord's anointed temple, also in Act 2, Scene 3. And here we have a religious metaphor comparing Duncan to a temple consecrated by God, and the verb phrase broke ope evokes violent destruction, and sacrilegious implies a direct offence against the divine, and anointed evokes ideas of sacred kingship and divine right. And this reinforces the spiritual significance of Duncan's death, and Shakespeare links kingship with religious sanctity, aligning with James I's ideology, thinking about the divine right of kings. And Macduff's grief here is not personal, it is civic and spiritual, showing his loyalty to Scotland. And then I must also feel it as a man. We have that in Act 4, Scene 3. So the modal verb must implies necessity and duty. And the contrastive conjunction also suggests emotional sensitivity does not exclude masculine action. The declarative sentence structure gives a clear moral stance, and feel challenges the early modern masculine ideal of stoicism, so kind of just keeping going in the face of adversity and difficulty. So this subverts conventional expectations of masculinity. Macduff becomes a model of honourable manhood, contrasting Macbeth's cold ambition, and this allows Shakespeare to question the cost of revenge and present grief as a form of moral strength. And then next up, also in Act 4, Scene 3, bleed, bleed, poor country. And the repetition of bleed intensifies the image of national suffering. Personification of Scotland, the country is a wounded, dying body, and also the exclamatory tone conveys anguish and urgency. Bleed suggests both internal decay and external violence. So Macduff is cast as the patriotic conscience of Scotland, highlights the moral and physical consequences of corrupt kingship, and adds to his portrayal as a figure of national redemption. Remember, he is the one who is going to save Scotland. So then we have in Act 5, Scene 8, a nice and easy one for you to remember. You have turn, hellhound, turn, and this imperative command, turn, asserts dominance and initiates the final moral confrontation. We have the zoomorphic metaphor, hellhound, which casts Macbeth as a devilish predator, and the alliteration in hellhound draws attention to its vividness. Hound implies a beastly, disloyal creature. Macbeth is driven by instinct, not honour, and hell aligns Macbeth with damnation, so hell, and reinforces the religious framing introduced in earlier acts. Macduff emerges as the agent of divine justice, restoring spiritual and political order, and this links with the earlier quotation, Hellkite, and reinforces this image of Macbeth as a monstrous bird of prey, as a predator associated with destruction and death. And then we have Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely ripped in Act 5, Scene 8. And the passive construction of was ripped implies a lack of agency, highlighting the violent, unnatural nature of his birth. And the euphemistic and ambiguous phrasing delays the full understanding of the prophecy's loophole. Untimely has a dual meaning, premature and ominous. And also ripped implies brutality, but also symbolic disruption. Macduff himself is an anomaly. It was very uncommon at the time for babies to be born by caesarean section, and he is a force of correction in a morally broken world. And this fulfills the witch's prophecy, exposing the danger of equivocation and hubris. And Macduff's birth becomes a metaphor for unexpected justice, born of violence, but ultimately restorative. And then we have Get Thee Back. My soul is too much charged with blood of thine. And that is in Act 5, Scene 8. And it is said by Macbeth, not Macduff. So the second person direct address thee adds intimacy and regret. And the verb charged is ambiguous. It's unclear what Macbeth means here. It can mean emotionally burdened with guilt or energized with power. And it suggests that Macbeth is either haunted by guilt for the murder of Macduff's family or feels invigorated by his own capacity for violence. And soul evokes inner morality. So charged implies that Macbeth is either soul weary or morally corrupted. So that's a really interesting quotation to analyze if you can unpick that. And the ambiguity forces the audience to question whether Macbeth retains any moral awareness or is purely driven by amoral ambition. And Macduff's role as Macbeth's moral reckoning, the one character who truly haunts him. So key context then. Now I mentioned this before, but the divine right of kings. So Macduff's horror at Duncan's murder reflects the belief that kings are chosen by God. And the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, the audience would relate to the fear of treason and regicide. And then James I's belief. So Shakespeare flatters James I, who traced his ancestry to Banquo and valued loyalty to the throne. And then also masculinity in the early modern period. So Stoicism was praised, but Macduff complicates this by valuing emotional honesty. And then the Union of the Crowns in 1603. Macduff's patriotism and sacrifice reflects concerns about Scottish identity and stability under one king. So then the audience reaction. A Jacobean audience would admire Macduff's moral rectitude and alignment with divine justice. And a modern audience might question his emotional suppression and potential hypocrisy in abandoning his family. And overall, he provokes admiration and discomfort. His moral clarity is powerful, but not unproblematic. So themes that connect to Macduff then: justice and revenge, honour and integrity, and tyranny versus legitimacy. So thinking about Shakespeare's intentions with the character of Macduff then, so to contrast tyranny with moral leadership, to redefine masculinity as complex and emotional, to reassure James I of the restoration of divine order, and to remind audiences that true kingship depends not on title, but on virtue, loyalty, and justice. And then considering Macduff as a construct. So Shakespeare constructs Macduff as a rhetorical and moral device in order to reflect the consequences of immoral kingship, recenter the narrative around justice and loyalty, offer a model of redeemed masculinity, embody the nation's suffering and hope, and to serve as a structural and symbolic contrast to Macbeth's downfall. And then applying some critical readings or theorists, because if you're aiming for those top grades, it's a fantastic thing to do. So a new historicist perspective might perceive Macduff's loyalty and how that mirrors contemporary anxieties about kingship and treason. From a psychoanalytic perspective, his grief may be seen as repressed trauma surfacing in moral action. A feminist perspective may see his grief is only validated when followed by revenge, reinforcing masculine codes. And a moralist perspective might view Macduff and how he acts as divine retribution, a Christ-like figure restoring moral order. And then a Nietzschean perspective could see his revenge and how it may represent power masked as morality. You could also consider Macduff from a post-structuralist perspective. Macduff restores meaning in a world destabilized by the witch's deceptive language. A Marxist perspective, as a symbol of the suffering of people, he leads revolt against corrupt monarchy. And then finally, Carol Gilligan's Ethics of Care. Macduff's emotional sensitivity aligns with a relational, empathetic moral framework. So that brings us to the end of this lesson. If you have found it useful, be sure to check out the other lessons and make use of the accompanying resources and quizzes on our website. And don't forget to follow us on social media as well.